Sådär. Varmt välkomna till Klimatkommunernas Webbfika. Maria heter jag, är en av 2 verksamhetsledare för Klimatkommunerna och idag gästas vår Webbfika av Kimberly Nicholas som är professor i hållbarhetsstudier vid Lunds Universitet. Och Kimberly ska berätta om sin bok Under the Sky We Make och ge oss lite tips och fakta. Så jag lämnar över till dig. Vi spelar in som sagt och ni får gärna ställa frågor under tiden Kimberly presenterar. Du kommer berätta på engelska men det går bra att ställa frågor på svenska. Ja, varsågod Kimberly.
Perfekt. Tusen tack Maria och tack att ni alla är här och att ni jobbar så hårt för klimatet. Som sagt, jag kommer att byta över nu till engelska för att slides kommer annars att bli en helt swinglish mess. Men det går jättebra för svenska också att diskutera. So I'll just give you a short introduction or a crash course about the content of my new book, which is called Under the Sky We Make, How to Be Human in a Warming World. And I have been working on this since 2017. It just came out in March. And it's been really wonderful to get to share it with folks. It's basically combining research from myself and from many scientific colleagues to try and make the climate and ecological crises relatable, understandable, and most importantly, actionable. So I'll start by sharing, I come from this really beautiful place called Sonoma. It's about an hour north of San Francisco in California. This is my parents' vineyard, which was the subject of my PhD studies from Stanford. I looked at Pinot Noir in the Napa and Sonoma valleys, which is where I'm from, and how they were being affected by climate change, how growers were adapting to climate change. And when I was doing this work now, starting almost 20 years ago, climate change was a much less urgent or less visceral threat than it has become today. And many of us have actually experienced now, we don't need to be experts looking at data sets, we can experience a climate crisis in our own lives. And that we've seen, for example, most devastatingly for me in the catastrophic wildfires in California, which have caused so much damage and devastation and trauma, have evacuated my parents and my sister, who thankfully did have a home to return to, but many of our friends were not so lucky. And we know that these fires are made worse by human-caused climate change. The fuels are drier, the vegetation is more flammable, the fires have been starting earlier, lasting later, and much bigger and more devastating than they would otherwise have been. So the kind of key takeaway from my talk and my book and everything I say is that life on Earth is in big trouble, and it's up to us to fix it. We happen to be alive at this absolutely critical time for the planet and human civilization. And what I mean by fix it is that we do what's necessary to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees of warming. That is the aspirational goal in the Paris Agreement. That is increasingly recognized for how critical it is scientifically to ensure that it's possible for both humans, society, and nature to continue to thrive. We also need to stop biodiversity loss and actually help nature recover and regenerate from the damage that we are inflicting, because it's both a climate and an ecological crisis that we find ourselves in now. And while we're doing this, we also need to be sure that we're centering human well-being, that we're prioritizing taking care of and respecting human needs and centering those alongside nature so that we actually have a sustainable world. If I sum up really quickly what everyone needs to know about climate change, it's almost a haiku, which is, it's warming, it's us, we're sure, it's bad, we can fix it. And there are thousands of peer-reviewed references backing this up. You can get an overview in the IPCC reports or my footnoted protest sign, which I have the references for on my website. But this is the key takeaway, and it's really important that people know this, because research shows that once people understand this, they're both more willing to make changes in their own lives and to support more ambitious climate policies. A key concept for why the climate crisis is so urgent and why we are basically out of time is the carbon budget. And I know there's a conference next week on carbon budgets in Sweden, which I'm looking forward to. But the basic idea is that we know that the amount of warming that the world experiences is basically determined by how much carbon pollution we add to the atmosphere. And the total amount that gets added to the atmosphere is like the water coming out of a faucet and filling the tub. So those are the sources of pollution. We have natural sinks, which are doing us a huge favor and taking up about half of the climate pollution that humans are adding. So the water level is, or the CO2 level in this case, is rising more slowly than it otherwise would, but it still is rising because sources are larger than sinks. And for the climate to stabilize, to stop warming, we actually have to entirely stop adding carbon to the atmosphere. And in practice, this means we need to turn the tap all the way off and get to the root of the problem. We have increasing evidence that we can't rely on increasing natural carbon sinks to take up our mess. And I think an important principle is to get to the root of the problem and solve it rather than trying to clean up a mess afterwards. This is just a visualization of how close we are to using up the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees of warming, and especially how fast this has happened. So in my great-grandparents' or grandparents' time, essentially all of the carbon budget remained. My parents, quite a lot. Now here's me. But for someone, a child born today, you see that they're born with the carbon budget almost entirely depleted and exhausted. And that's why this resource that is supposed to be shared by all of humanity for all of time across every generation, because carbon essentially lasts forever. Some of it in the atmosphere lasts for 10,000 years, which is about twice as long as the pyramids in Egypt or Stonehenge have been around. So humans are leaving this incredibly long-lived legacy of climate pollution in the atmosphere. And that's why the time is so urgent now. We are globally not doing nearly enough. We are currently on track for really catastrophic and devastating climate warming. So current climate policies lead to about 3 degrees of warming. That is far in excess of even the upper limit of 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees in the Paris Agreement. The recent pledges and targets have been encouraging steps in the right direction, but they are still far short of what science shows is necessary to actually meet either the 1.5 degree or even the 2 degree target. So we need policies and actions that are much bigger and faster and more ambitious. And this is a global analysis from this month, but this is also true in Sweden. We know that we are not on track to meet our national climate goal with current policies and pledges. That's what the Klimatpolitiska rådet, I forget what that is in English, report shows. And that's the same story in Lund as well. So current policies, not enough. We have to do more. Basically, what that means is two things. It is leaving fossil fuels in the ground, and it is switching to regenerative and sustainable agriculture. Those are the root sources of the climate problem. You see here that here focusing on carbon, the main greenhouse gas causing warming, about 87% comes from burning coal, oil, and gas, and we just have to stop doing that. That's been quite clear for a long time, but I think is becoming now more mainstream and recognized, for example, in the International Energy Agency report this week, which is quite remarkable considering that organization was founded in the 70s to ensure oil supply, and now is, quite clearly endorsing the science and that burning fossil fuels is the cause of the problem, and we've got to leave them in the ground. So here's what needs to happen, and what we need to be working to help make happen is that ideally emissions will have already peaked. So what needs to happen basically is that every year from now, global emissions are plummeting towards zero. And it would have been easier and cheaper and less work to do this if we had started seriously doing it earlier. But the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. So we have to work with where we are and what we have and start doing what's necessary to really quickly drop emissions towards zero. I think given time, I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just a quick look at the biodiversity crisis, which shows how fish from the same location in Florida have been overfished and diminished over time. From the 1950s to the 1980s to the last decade, the number and diversity and size of fish really diminished, and that is a sign of the human destruction of nature that is happening at the same time as the climate crisis. We know that if we look at the human side, that the world today is basically both unequal and unsustainable, that there is a small group that enjoys a very high standard of living, but also has very high climate and environmental impact. The majority are in the global middle class with pretty moderate consumption, and there are more than 1 billion people who live in poverty where even their basic needs and rights for clean water and nutritious food and the essentials for life are not being met. So essentially our challenge is for the whole world to converge on sustainability, which would be where on this graph where all of the social needs are met, but none of the environmental planetary boundaries are exceeded. That's the safe and just operating space, or that donut that Kate Raworth writes about. So Julia Steinberger says we are all developing countries, meaning we all need to develop towards this empty circle of sustainability, because at the moment, high-income countries like Sweden, the US, much of Europe, are doing a pretty good job at meeting social needs, but greatly over-consuming our fair share of resources. And low-income countries here like Uganda, Indonesia, are really failing their populations, their citizens, by not meeting their social needs, but they are treading lightly on the environment. So they need to increase resource consumption somewhat to meet those needs, but stay within the planetary boundaries while meeting social needs. Here's what we'll have to do to solve it is basically simple, but not easy. As I said, it's leaving fossil fuels in the ground. So stopping the transfer of carbon from the earth to the atmosphere, because it's not causing us problems in the earth and it is causing us problems in the atmosphere. And that means we have to stop the consumption and production of fossil fuels. So this whole chain shows that while it's true that over 70% of industrial emissions come from 100 energy and large oil companies, it's also true that around 70% of emissions come from household consumption. And the reason is you see how all these things are connected throughout the whole supply chain. So we need to have both aspects in mind and take responsibility for where we can. This doesn't mean that the misinformation and deception of some of these companies, which has been well documented, doesn't let them off the hook. But consumers also do have an important role to play. And the second part is taking care of nature like our lives depend on it, because they really do. So protecting and preserving and expanding and restoring and rewilding the land and the oceans is a really important part of solving biodiversity. And if we're lucky, also potentially taking up some of the carbon that we've already added to the atmosphere. But even for non-carbon reasons, it's really essential that we do this. So those are the main principles that I write about in the book, and I summarize it as respecting life, both human and nature, is what I mean by that. Stop harming life, get to the root cause of the problems that are driving energy or fossil fuel consumption and other exploitative and harmful practices, and strengthen life. And that I mean both our own capacity to do this hard work to build community and strengthen resilience, and the resilience of natural ecosystems to tolerate and adapt and even thrive with change and be able to get through hard times. So I think I want to leave time for questions, so I'll just give a couple of highlights here. The middle part of the book, that was the facts. The middle part of the book deals with a lot of feelings, which wasn't what I was trained for in grad school, but has turned out to be a big part of the job, because being a climate and environmental scientist has come to, I got into this because I loved being outside and hiking around in nature and looking at patterns and trying to use my curiosity. And it really has meant instead bearing witness to the death or demise of many of the places and systems that I love. And that has been really painful and devastating. One example that I came to recently was that I had the chance to hike to Kebnekaise in 2019. And I stopped just short of the peak because I didn't have crampons and I didn't want to fall down this slope. And I thought, okay, I can always come back next year. Well, 2020 didn't turn out as planned for anyone, but in any case, it would have been impossible for me to climb that peak because, as you may know, that glacier on the summit of that peak, Sweden's highest mountain, has actually melted away in the meantime. So it's not there anymore. And we're really seeing the world changing under our feet. And that is really hard to cope with. And I think requires that we follow what I call the 5 stages of radical climate acceptance. And by this, I mean, I'm not talking about giving up, but I'm talking about viewing reality as it is and being able to change what we can and accept what we can't. And for me, the main point here, I'm happy to talk about it more, but I think the main point has been not being afraid to face difficult feelings, and in fact, to use challenging feelings like grief or anger or other things to help orient me for what my values are and what really is important to me, and use that as a North Star to help find and identify a purpose and pursue that purpose in the work that I do in the community that I build and I'm a part of. And that, I think, has been a really important tool for getting up and getting out of bed and doing the work every day. Then I'll just say, the third part and about the half of the book is about what can I do. And I talk about 3 levels, which are the personal, the community, and the system. And I think we need change on all of these levels. It's necessary and important to work on all of them. Please feel free to start or continue with whatever level you prefer. Increasingly, I think it's clear that these levels support and reinforce each other and do not compete with each other. So we should be supporting each other in doing this work across different ways of working. But I do want to say that it is really important for one group of people, which includes me, to actually take personal action and through lifestyle changes, reduce our own overconsumption. And we are the group that I'm talking about, that includes me, is this group of high income earners. Here it's about over $38,000 per year. Puts you in the top 10% globally. So I haven't done the exact conversion, but that'd be something like, over 400,000 kroner per year. And the data show that the more money you earn, the more carbon you burn, unfortunately. And the more income that is, the higher that tends to go up. So basically, we need system change to have mobility and energy and electricity and food that meets human needs without wrecking the climate. And that will help the majority of people on Earth make this transition to lead a life compatible with 1.5 degrees of warming. But we also, at the same time, do need to reduce overconsumption for this high consuming group. And I go through what that means from our 2017 study. The highest impact actions are going flight, car, and meat free. Those are, I think I have, yes, here, some work by Diana Ivanova and a colleague show that what the breakdown is of where that consumption comes from. This is for Europe. And you see that it's the pink and purple colors, which is car transport and air transport, that are disproportionately increasing and adding up to the majority of emissions for high emitting individuals. So really focusing on the reduced need for mobility and reducing private car use and flights is a really important part of the picture of meeting our overconsumption budget. I also tell stories, I won't go into too much detail here, but of my grandfather helping to invent the system of factory farming for turkeys, which is not a legacy that I'm proud of, since much of my research has dealt with the harm that the industrial agriculture system does to the environment today, and the damage from this focus on producing the maximum amount with relying on a lot of inputs and not worrying about the outputs in terms of social and environmental harms is really not a sustainable food system. And so I write about the transition to a healthy and sustainable food system, what that would look like. And a lot of it is more plant-based diets, as well as a number of other changes, which are good for both people and biodiversity. We need to also change the system of politics, of money and power, and I share what the research shows is most effective there, including things like voting, especially for women candidates, has been shown to reduce emissions, candidates with good environmental scores. In terms of putting these things into practice myself, I'm a recovering frequent flyer. So my expired frequent flyer card is in a museum called, an exhibit called Carbon Ruins, which colleagues at Lunds University developed, which is looking back on the concluded fossil fuel era from 2053. So Sweden has successfully made this transition to be fossil free, and we can now look with curiosity and disbelief at these bizarre artifacts that used to be part of unsustainable living. So in my case, I have stopped flying within Europe in 2012 and reduced my flying over 90%. I still haven't given up flying because I am going back to see my family in North America. But I have a goal to replace that with sailing, which has been a bit interrupted by the pandemic, but I hope to work on my sailing skills again this summer. So going also car-free and meat-free has been part of my choices. And I write about how these personal choices also ripple out and affect others. And we know that they do play a big difference. And I think just then in conclusion, I think that I just was listening to one of my students who's defending her thesis on Monday. And she's looking at what are effective measures for Sweden to reduce car use, which will be necessary for us to meet our transport and climate goal. And one of her conclusions from her study is that local municipalities actually play a critical role in whether or not that happens. So I think the work that the Klimatkommunernas are doing in Sweden is absolutely essential. We really depend on you to help us meet these goals. And I think catalyzing and making these connections and partnerships and opportunities for different actors and communities to come together is a super, super important role. So I'm very grateful for the work that you're doing. I want to stop there and leave some time for questions, so I can stop sharing my screen and say thanks for your attention, and I look forward to discussing.
Tusen tack, vad spännande att höra och bra med den här tydliga faktagenomgången också. Jag tänker vi är inte så jättemånga, så är det någon som har en fråga till Kimberly så är det bara att sätta på sin mikrofon och ställa den, eller så går det bara att skriva i chatten också så fångar vi upp den. Du avslutar lite här med tips till kommuner. Är det någonting annat något medskick du vill göra till just om man jobbar på en kommun? Vad är viktigast att tänka på och hur kan man få alla med sig?
Ja, det känns som mest viktiga just nu, för att vi vet att tiden är inte på vår sida, att vi hinner oss inte vid så mycket tid för att snabbt ställa oss om. Och från forskningssidan så är det tydligt att den avgörande faktor där är samhälls trust and social networks. Så desto mer kommunerna kan göra för att skapa community, att ha bra kommunikation, det är faktiskt jätteviktigt för att omställningen kan gå i tid.
Just det. Vad spännande. Jag vill också passa på att tipsa jag såklart om att köpa Kimberlys bok, men också prenumerera på ditt nyhetsbrev. Jag kan lägga en länk i chatten här, så kan ni gå in och prenumerera på det också.
Ja, så den heter We Can Fix It. Det kommer ut sista torsdag varje månad. Och där jag sammanfattar kort ny forskning, kultur, en lite smorgasbord av facts, feelings and action för klimatet. Och så i april så var det en studie som visade att om man röstar på en konservativ parti i Kanada så tredubblar man sitt koldioxidavtryck, för att deras policy hade en så stor effekt som det var mycket mer som en personlig val. Så det var jätteintressant till exempel. Och nu jag kommer att sammanfatta en ny studie som handlar om kläder och fast fashion och hur mycket påverkan har det egentligen. Så det får du prenumerera för.
Vi fick en fråga här om du skulle vilja dela din presentation. Går det bra att vi skickar ut den till deltagarna?
Ja, absolut.
Jättebra. Är det någon som har någon fråga här till Kimberly? Ja, Anna, varsågod.
Så, tackar. Hör ni mig nu?
Ja.
Yes.
Ja. Ja, ska jag ta det på svenska eller engelska?
Det går bra på svenska.
Ja, okej. Jo, tack. Jag har ibland tänkt så här att eftersom man själv gillar att resa väldigt mycket så blir det ju en väldigt mycket klimatdilemma kring resande och så. Men jag tänker ibland att man kan tänka så att jag kan resa, men jag kan då i utbyte avstå från att liksom köpa mat som har rest med flyg då exempelvis. Finns det någon sån beräkning eller studie eller liksom täckning för ett sånt påstående, eller är det bara en dålig bortförklaring för att jag själv ska kunna få resa med?
Bra idé. Siffrorna står inte på din sida tyvärr. Så vår studie i 2017 visade att till exempel om man skippar ett år köttätande så sparar man 0,8 ton av koldioxid totalt.
Och så ett år av?
Ett år utan att äta kött. Så ett vegetariskt år. Så mindre än 1 ton. Jämfört med om man flyger till exempel Arlanda, New York. Det står för 1,6 ton. Så man måste avstå från 2 års köttätande för att bli samma effekt som att skippa en flyg. Så, och det är kött eller inte kött som har den största påverkan av klimatet. Det spelar inte så stor roll varifrån kommer maten. Det är bäst att undvika maten som skickas med flyg. Det stämmer. Men överallt det är mycket mer viktigt att undvika kött. Och man måste övertyga ganska många att undvika kött för att det kommer att räcka upp till en flygresa tyvärr.
Så jag måste övertyga 2 stycken om att de ska avstå kött i 2 år för att jag själv ska få flyga till New York.
Ja, men samtidigt har vi en budget av max 2,5 ton per person och år om vi ska nå 2030-målet. Så det finns inte riktigt utrymme för att flyga tyvärr. Men på andra sidan, jag kan skicka en länk till en video som 3 studenter från Frankrike har gjort. Det finns jättemycket, jag tror en viktig grej är att vi lämnar bort idén att för att resa man måste flyga. För man kan absolut resa utan att flyga. Och om man öppnar upp lite bredare för hur ska jag dit och vad kan jag göra för att göra det, så det kommer att bli en större äventyr kanske. Och att resa på något annat sätt, att resa lite långsammare och ta mer tid och stanna längre på destinationen och så, det kan bli ett sätt att tänka att hur kan man resa klimatsmart.
Ja, men tack.
Men för du är inne på budgettänket. Tycker du ändå att det är ett bra tänk att man ska försöka beräkna sina personliga utsläpp och hålla sig inom den här budgeten? Eller hur ska man tänka?
Ja, jag tror det kan vara en hjälpmedel. Och jag vet till exempel här i Skåne har vi ett mål att halvera hushållsutsläppen. Så måste vi mäta på något sätt hur ska vi från 10 ton ungefär per person till 5 redan 2030. Och om vi ska faktiskt nå vårt mål här i Lund att bli klimatneutralt redan 2030 och bli ledande inom EU, så måste vi gå även vidare. Så jag tror det är ganska många som, om vi har fokus, och vår studie var för det, om vi har fokus på att undvika kött, flyg och bil, det ger den största effekt, och det har det fokus på vad står för mest utsläppen. Men ganska många är inte medvetna att men jag själv ligger i den här 10% som står för den största ställ, och det är faktiskt jag som måste byta livsstil för att vi kommer att nå klimatmålen. Så det kan vara ögonöppnande. Jag tycker om Sitra i Finland. Den heter 100 Smart Ways. Så det är mitt favoritkalkylatör.
Okej, jättebra tips. Tack. Tack så jättemycket. Nu får vi läsa mer i din bok och som sagt prenumerera på nyhetsbrevet. Tack Kimberly och tack för alla som var med här idag. Så ses vi på webbfikor framöver. Ha det gott!
Det låter jättebra och tack